to Russia. Wanna drive a tank, drink and have some fun. Until we see they don't take me to Russia. So what can't you be? Vodka almost free. Hard bases motherland, take me to Russia. I wanna drive a tank, drink and have some fun. Until we see they don't take me to Russia. Gangsta KGB, Russian bears gonna set you free.
Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Russian foreign policy. I gotta say, I was really happy to see the amount of engagement and comments in last week's video, particularly from many of you within the YouTube sphere. I think that this idea of public scholarship has really resonated with many of you. I read through most of your comments. I plan on responding to those that I haven't already, but a lot of you kind of tell me that you're the perfect type of person for this, right? You're either in college, university, but you're studying something other than poli-sci and IR. You've graduated already, but you both have an interest in this subject matter. And rather than, spending thousands of dollars, at least in the United States, on a class or for a semester, it's something like this that you really like to engage in. Well, this is absolutely perfect for me. I mean, I'm really happy to know that, I have a growing audience here. And, by that, I'm happy to say I found my first 4 patrons on Patreon. I mean, it's not much, but, a week ago I had 0. And so a lot of you really seem to be enjoying the material. I thank you, for those 4. Thank you very, very much for being the pioneers, the trailblazers. And for the rest of you, if there is, something that you find within not just this video, but the video series over the next 5 or so weeks, please give my Patreon page a look over. It's still very rudimentary. Right now, I have only one entry-level tier, and that's just simply $5 a month, right? It's just simply a way of showing your appreciation and gratitude for the time that I put not just these videos together, but I also am continuing to work on the translation videos. So it's something that I'm really excited about, and I hope to invest more time and energy, not just to classes like this, but to address the very subject of public scholarship. All right, so with that said, let's get started. Let's move into what the title is here, The Ideological Foundations of Russian Foreign Policy, 1991 to the present. So it's going to be a little, scenic tour through the last 30 years of Russia's post-Soviet development and helping us understand really how we got to really where we are today. And I think that it's important to recall some of our preliminary hypotheses from last time around. I like to always use the conclusion from the previous lecture as a springboard into this. And there were about 3 or 4 big things that we walked away from. I think the most important thing is noting Russia's international emergence, reemergence, within a multipolar system of power that capitalizes on America's global strengths as well as weaknesses, right? So this multipolar system of which Russia, the US, China, at least those 3 are involved in, we've talked about how Russia places an emphasis on international institutionalism, legal principles, and moral norms. And while there is no direct reference to, capitalizing on the U.S.'s shortcomings, it's clear to observers that Russia is seeking a strategy that tries to provide, if nothing else, an alternative to the pre-existing American liberal international order. And I think that this raises the third issue, the need to read Russia right. And this is something that most have been doing wrong, I think, over the past 30 or so years. But reading Russia right outside the lens of American perceptions, misperceptions, and interpretations and misinterpretations. The problem is, as I mentioned, is that Russia is continuously viewed through the lens of the Cold War, and maybe even the 1990s. We still see Russia through our own Soviet-made lenses. And even if we pay reference to Russia in the 90s, right? In that one period, that near decade period where Russia was kind of teetering and stumbling towards some form of parliamentary democracy, right? All that seems to have been swept away in the last 20 years by Vladimir Putin, who of course is viewed as this, anti-democratic 20th century autocrat. Particularly in light of the conflict in Ukraine, he has been likened to Hitler, to Stalin, to, you pick your, Saturday morning cartoon villain here. And I think that it does a major disservice to not just American foreign policy, but the way in which we see ourselves in the world, right? If we cast Russia as the movie villain, and we as basically G.I. Joe, we're going to continue to think that we're the only force for good in the world. Now, this isn't me saying that Russia is an alternative source of good. It just is that in order to understand multipolarism, we need to realize that liberalism is no longer a copyrighted trademark in global development, right? And I'm going to get to all of that in this week. I think that this also means the importance of noting constructivism, right? Constructivism is, you can call it a theory of IR, you can call it an application, more or less. Mearsheimer and others would probably say it's one way of, understanding realism a little bit better. I'm okay with that. But constructivism, which, as I mentioned, tells us how states view other states, how they view themselves within the world, is something that emphasizes the importance of identity, but also brings in domestic politics at the international field. So this is something that realism by itself does not do. Realism doesn't care about domestic affairs, right? The international arena is one thing, domestic affairs, something entirely different. So how do we do this then? How do we move forward with all of this material that we've accumulated so far? Well, there's really two ways that I want to do this. And I think based on how long the first half of this goes, I may feel the need to put the second one in another video. But right now, I want to use this video to identify key moments and developments in Russian international relations since 1991, vis-a-vis the United States, NATO, and global development. So this is really a history course, right? Important dates and times that I think we all need to be aware of in order to get a proper understanding of where we are at the time of this recording, mid-July 2022. This includes looking at the critically important yet overlooked decade of the 1990s. This will be very apparent once we get to the politics and the persona of Vladimir Putin. And the second thing that I feel we need to do is examine the philosophical underpinnings of sovereign democracy, right? I want to get this early on in the class. What exactly is Russia's ideology? What is the message that it's trying to project out into the world, right? What's Putin's strategy? Is he trying to resurrect the Soviet Union? No. What is it that he's trying to do? Most sources look to the idea of sovereign democracy, and this is something that I probably will do in the second video, depending upon how far I go in this one. But this also is needed to look at in order to address the weaknesses and the shortcomings of globalized neoliberalism, right? So here we are, 2022. We are effectively 30 years into, roughly speaking, the so-called age of globalization. And how globalization is defined is really through the lens of economic neoliberalism, right? Free market fundamentalism, the reduction, the elimination of state intervention in the internal affairs of economic development, right? The rise of corporations. And, occasionally there is this infusion of liberal democratic principles, which plays on the importance of identity, and more specifically, individual identity. Sovereign democracy may be seen as some kind of handbook for, if not countering globalization itself, definitely countering globalized neoliberalism. And at the same time, not looking to discount democracy, but definitely this type of liberal, individualized democracy. And, however way you want to look at this, this could be seen really as Russia's application of soft power. Right? There's hard power, soft power. We talked about this in the previous lecture. Hard power is military presence and applied economics. Soft power is more of a cultural, ideological way of projecting one's values onto the rest of the world. The United States is probably the best example of a soft power, right? The transatlantic world after 1945 was more receptive to American consumerism and pop culture than they were, let's say, principles of collective security and military installations, right? All of this will be, given in greater specifics, right, as we move forward. But let's start with the first one, right? Let's kind of bring ourselves back, right? Let's kind of take ourselves back to the late 80s, the early 90s. The Soviet Union, collapsed and resulted in 15 emerging independent states. Russia being the biggest one, Ukraine and Belarus being two others. Then we have the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. We have the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. We have this one little outlier state in southwestern Ukraine called Moldova. It's largely a Romanian-speaking state. It used to be part of Romania up until the Second World War. And then we have Central Asia, right? The Stans: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And for many of these countries, they went to, I like to sort of euphemistically say this, they went to bed one night in the Soviet Union and they woke up the next morning an independent state. Some countries were more prepared to handle this than others. When we get to Central Asia, the transition was, I think, much more abrupt and much less expected. But that's not to say that Russia did not have its own fits and bouts. And that's why Russia in the 1990s, I think, is so important for us to at least get the basics down. Not just what the country went through, but its leadership, specifically Boris Yeltsin, right? We tend to forget about Yeltsin, right? He's been dead for a number of years, and he is seen, I think, in the grand scheme of history as largely a failure. He had his moments. He certainly was instrumental in putting down the coup that attempted to reinstate hardcore Stalinist ideology in the twilight days of the Soviet Union, right? So he had his moment, but his leadership was marked by just rampant bouts of corruption, dysfunctionality, and his own inability at getting a grasp on just the ensuing chaos that emerged in Russia at the time. So, by looking here at some key moments, the Soviet Union really began to start unraveling, I would say, as early as 1986 with the Chernobyl disaster. And, any of you who remember that great HBO show a couple of years ago, right? It's obviously based on a true story. There's a lot of things that were embellished. But the important thing to get from Chernobyl isn't that there was a nuclear reactor that broke down and nearly destroyed the world, but it was really two things. One, the infrastructure of the country was seen to be woefully inadequate, and just as bad, the initial response by the state apparatus was to cover it all up. Because God forbid word gets out that the infrastructure is inadequate, which means that there could be multiple Chernobyls afterwards. So it just sort of shows already the internal decay of a, lumbering, stumbling, bureaucratic authoritarian regime. Jump a couple of years ahead to 1989, 1990, and we see a number of anti-authoritarian revolutions across Eastern Europe, right? Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. The CNN moment was certainly when the Berlin Wall opened up in November of 1989. New Year's 1989 to 1990, right? David Hasselhoff basically achieves the pinnacle of his career, and I may want to, make this argument: humanity reaches the pinnacle of its collective optimism, where he sings "I've been looking for freedom." Germany reunites 1 year later in October of 1990, and it really is it's a clear sign right, that the Soviet sphere of influence across Eastern Europe is coming to an end. And if all of these countries can overthrow and replace their single-party authoritarian states with elected parliamentary democracies, why can't the Soviet Union, which lumbers on for another 2 years? While this is not directly related to the Soviet Union, I have to say that the first Gulf War, right, the one in 1990 where Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades Kuwait, the most important thing to note here is how little the Soviet Union got involved, how unbelievably unimportant it was. Right, so Iraq invades Kuwait, State A invades State B. Right, the United States is really good at seeing this. It's like Germany invades Poland, and Bush the Elder puts together this international coalition of the willing to effectively isolate Iraq, and if not get Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait, go to war, right? And Operation Desert Storm happens. It's the perfect little war that, as far as American psyche is concerned, wipes clean the stigma of Vietnam, right? So here is really, I think, where the United States enters into its unipolar period with the first Gulf War, right? It was just a decisive victory, militarily speaking, diplomatically speaking. The Soviet Union was still around, but it just didn't have any major role to play. And the United States didn't really care that much about it. And about a year later, an attempted coup within the Soviet Union to upend the reforms of Gorbachev and reinstate some hardline 1930s Stalinist policies met with a resounding failure. The army was called in to fire upon the protesters in Moscow and Leningrad, and they refused the orders. And before you know it, the whole thing just comes crashing down. Right? 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. I remember watching this on TV. The red flag, right, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time. I think it's either December the 25th or the 26th, 1991, and up comes the Russian tricolor. And before you know it, the Cold War is over. Not a single shot was fired. We didn't have to engage in World War III. I mean, as far as an American was concerned, it was a great time to be alive, right? The 90s were kind of like our victory lap. But what was happening in Russia at the time, right? The day after, we enter into what I euphemistically call the Weimar Russia period, which, if you know anything about the name Weimar, it's not a nice term. It has potential, but it certainly implies high degrees of political pluralism, but to the point of political extremism, rampant economic corruption and instability, and a general decay of the political center. So this is Russia entering its period of transition, transitioning from a single-party, state-managed bureaucracy from the last 75 years into something it had never been before. And, looking around the world for some kind of guidance, I mean, the United States at the time is simply saying, be a democracy. Oh, and be capitalist as well. In fact, this is, in a way, the simplistic policy that was leveled towards Russia. There was this very infamous article published in The Economist in January of 1990. If I can give a link below, I will, as I'm just thinking about it right now. And the article was published by Jeffrey Sachs. You probably have heard of him before, right? Jeffrey Sachs is widely regarded as one of the original founders, the original architects of modern globalization. He has since gone on to regret that and, has become a big supporter of Bernie Sanders and, sort of a return of social democracy. So good for him. But this is early Jeffrey Sachs. And the article, aptly titled, What is to be Done, right, sort of taken from Lenin's essay, right, Что делать, is a recipe for the emerging countries, the emerging governments of the communist world for political and economic reform. And even though the term shock therapy isn't mentioned in the article, the term is used to describe the policies that the article writes out. And that is a quick, decisive, and uncompromising transition to market economic reform, the privatization of capitalism. And so what that effectively implies means rolling back state regulation, debureaucratizing as much of the state apparatus as possible, and eliminating any kind of barriers, obstacles, fail-safes or whatever it is for capital reform. In other words, it's the understanding that market reform is going to then provide political reform, social reform, and even cultural reform. This is really the heart of what neoliberalism argues, is that have a problem, let the market solve it. Right? And you can think of this, let's say in the United States, as policies of, let's say, gentrification. Right? How do we solve urban blight? How do we change around a dilapidated neighborhood? Sell everything at fire sale prices. Let corporations, let restaurants, let retail enter into it. Jack up the price of the rents, and eventually the place will be a wonderful, livable, photogenic community. I may be sounding a bit too simplistic, but that's effectively the crux of the article. And alongside that was the very clear emphasis. There can be no transition to, let's say, third-way socialism. There can be no Yugoslav model of worker self-management. It basically is a 5-year plan to go from whatever the hell you are now to whatever the United States is as quickly as possible. And the transition is going to be painful. It's going to create unemployment. It's going to foster job loss. Companies are probably going to go under, but competition, innovation, and healthy creativity, entrepreneurialism is going to quickly replace it, right? And the idea here is that, be prepared for, a period of, no pain, no gain. But if you do it right and you follow the rules and you try not to really hesitate, the sooner you'll reach that economic reform promised land. So the next 5 years, the 1990s, Sachs says for many of these Eastern European countries is going to be, we're going to have to tighten our belts, and it's going to be a rather traumatic experience. But he argues by 2000, we're all going to be laughing at what we had to do in order to be now where we are, right? So it's, short-term losses are going to provide excessively long-term gains. The problem with neoliberalism, and Sachs has, to his credit, gone on record to say, yeah, he was wrong as well, is that we tend to expect that transition period to be completely bereft of any political extremism, social unrest. Like everybody's just going to be like waiting there in the wings, knowing what they have to do, but expecting some nice orderly outcome afterwards. And that doesn't happen, right? Amid economic downturn, the rise of organized crime, the black market, oligarchism, some people get unbelievably rich while others get unbelievably poor. I mean, people are not going to sit around and wait and say, well, okay, 2 years down, 3 years to go. No, they're going to be angry. Why? Because they can't pay their bills. They can't afford the basic necessities of life, and more to the point, some of them are going to start remembering how better it was in the authoritarian period, right? Authoritarian nostalgia begins to pick up. And this is clearly the case in Russia, where by 93, 94, people were saying, Soviet Union wasn't all that bad. I mean, sure, we had our problems, but they're nowhere near as bad as they are right now. And look, it's not just that Russia was stabilized while transitioning. The country was undergoing tumultuous transition outside of neoliberal reform. And I point to the 1993 constitutional crisis when Yeltsin disbands the Supreme Soviet. So we tend to forget, right? The Soviet Union breaks up, Yeltsin comes to power, Gorbachev is, pushed into retirement, but the legislature remains. The Communist Party is still there, and they're not all that willing to cooperate. Not just because they're against the notions of neoliberalism, but, sometimes they're old party apparatchiks. They don't want to go. They don't want to be told that they can no longer feed from the trough. So there's a major obstacle that Yeltsin has to deal with, and he eventually deals with it by effectively calling on the military to declare martial law and disband the parliament. And this is seen by the Communist Party and others as sort of a rollback on democratic reforms, and Yeltsin kind of becoming some form of autocrat. Alongside that, is in, internal separatist movements throughout Russia. The Soviet Union breaks up into 15 states, but that doesn't mean that each of these emerging states are unified. Now, within Russia itself, right, there's a huge area within the Caucasus that are populated by non-Russians, Chechens, Dagestanis, Ingush, among others. And, the smell of separatism certainly attracts those within constituent states, right? It's not just in the Soviet Union. We see this in the former Yugoslavia, particularly in Kosovo, with Serbia, and that is, if constituent federal republics of a larger state can break away, what about regions within these smaller states? Now, constitutionally speaking, they cannot. So Ukraine can break away, Belarus can break away, but Crimea cannot break away from Ukraine. Chechnya cannot break away from Russia. Kosovo cannot break away from Serbia. You get the idea, right? Well, that's the legal standpoint. From the point of view of the people on the ground, legal be damned. And the biggest example of this type of, political extremism and separatism came from Chechnya. And it's not enough that there was a war of secession. It's not enough that Russia tried to prevent this secession. I mean, technically speaking, there's really nothing, at least at that time, worth defending in Chechnya. But the problem was this. If Yeltsin let Chechnya go by simply saying, just write off Chechnya. We don't need it. We don't want it. Fine. You want to be a failed state? Go right ahead. That opens up the door to Dagestan and Ingushetia and Ossetia and Tatarstan and everyone else, right? If this one can go, everyone else can go, right? And so Russia's going to be fighting tooth and nail to keep this peripheral region from breaking away, really for two reasons. One, for the, one that I had just mentioned before with the Pandora's box, but two, to stop the stigma of disintegration, right? I mean, it's already bad enough that the Soviet Union collapses. Now, is Russia going to collapse, right? Is there like a new wave of territorial fragmentation? The embarrassment, the idea that Russia, the heir to the great Soviet Union, can barely hold on to these little regional peripheries in the Caucasus is nothing short of embarrassing. And it makes Russia look weak in the international arena, which, by the 1990s, that's what we kind of see, right? Russia just going through this, year after year binge of post-Soviet trauma. And it's not helped when the Chechen separatists effectively rout the Russian army, take control of the region, and declare an independent state that no one recognizes around the world, the Republic of Ichkeria. It also doesn't help, and this is something that we don't notice back then, that a number of the Chechen separatists are being equipped and trained by this then little-known group called Al-Qaeda. Chechnya will effectively remain under rebel control for the next couple of years. To add insult to injury, there's two other things that happen. The first, and both of them happened in 1999. Now, 1999 is probably the nadir of Russia's post-Soviet experience and simultaneously the apex of American unipolarism. Right? It doesn't get any better for the U.S. after 1999. 1999, in my opinion, is the golden age of American unipolarism for a number of reasons. First, NATO experiences its first expansion after the collapse of the Cold War system. And this is something that irks Russia even to this very day. In 1999, NATO admits Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into its ranks. Russia opposes this on the grounds that back in 1990, when Germany reunified, Russia made an agreement with the United States that it would relinquish its influence over what was then East Germany, allowing for a unification of the country. That would effectively put the former East German state into NATO, as well as the then-known European community, now known as the European Union. But in return, NATO would make the promise, according to Russia, not to, quote, move 1 inch further to the east. In other words, no Poland, no Hungary, no Eastern Europe, no nothing. In fact, right around this time, we're thinking 90, 91, there were some policymakers in the United States suggesting that NATO had achieved its goals, it had achieved its objectives, and therefore should just simply disband. The Soviet Union is no longer a threat. Germany is fully integrated into the transatlantic alliance. NATO has done what it was supposed to do. And by keeping NATO there, while Warsaw Pact, right, this was the Soviet Union's version of NATO, while Warsaw Pact dissolved, NATO's retention would provide a security dilemma. So if Warsaw Pact dissolves, NATO should dissolve, and maybe if there's talk of some European military alliance, it should include effectively Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, but minus the United States, right? And even Mearsheimer back in the day was saying that the United States no longer needs to have its military presence in Europe. It's only going to be seen eventually, but decisively, as an encroachment. But what we find in reality is that not only does NATO expand in '99, it continues to do so up to the present period. So by including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, it shows that NATO can adapt, but it also shows that these former Soviet satellites now want to be part of a US-led military alliance. And in the same year, NATO initiates its bombardment of Yugoslavia/Serbia over the ongoing tensions and clashes within Kosovo, right? So Serbia, not part of the Soviet Union, but former Yugoslavia. There had been separatism happening in the province of Kosovo, which is demographically populated by Albanians. Albanians make up the majority, and they had wanted to secede, in the same way as Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, among others. Realizing that they are not going to get their secession in the same way because they are not a constituent republic, they opt for raising the stakes through military extremism and terrorism, but while remaining overwhelmingly pro-Western and pro-American. The United States takes sympathy to this, issues ultimatums against the then government of Slobodan Milosevic, who was sort of seen as public enemy number one in the Balkans, and initiates a bombardment against Belgrade in March of '99, and outside of any UN approval, and much to the avoidance of any Russian opposition. So the bombardment of Yugoslavia outside of UN resolution, the expansion of NATO of the same year, basically says to Russia that the United States just doesn't care about them, that Russia is irrelevant. They're no longer a major power to worry about. Sure, small countries can voice grievances over what bigger countries do. But according to the realist philosophy, you're small, I'm big, I don't care what you say. And this is what Russia sort of found itself in, at the end of 1999. So 99 is a big year. It's really, in my opinion, the apex of American unipolarism, and it is the nadir of Russia's post-Soviet experience. And, look, while he should not deserve all the blame for this, right, there's plenty of blame to go around institutionally, Yeltsin was really the target of criticism, of indignation, among many, many Russians. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting, because Yeltsin was liked in the West, right? He particularly got along great with Bill Clinton. And the thing is that from an American perspective, right, Yeltsin kind of embodied some of the more positively negative stereotypes of Russia at the time, right? He was big, he was gregarious, he was funny, he was friendly, he was kind of like the big, Russian bear, the big huggable Russian bear. And he was also kind of like that stumbling, bumbling, yet lovable uncle that you're always happy to find out is coming to the family gatherings, but you're not going to entrust him with any responsibility of family finances, right? He's good for a couple of drinks, he's good for a few jokes, and that was it. And the problem is that there's nothing wrong with that characteristic, except you don't want that running Russia, especially when the country is effectively fragmenting among political, economic, cultural, regional warlordism. And, the other problem is this. By the end of his career, look, Yeltsin liked the sauce. He was, more times half in the bag than not. And, there were plenty of times where Yeltsin would be giving speeches and other things where, his words would be slurred. He wouldn't know where he was going. He's got videos of him dancing up there, whatever it is. And it's like, it's sort of unbecoming of a leader, especially a leader of a country that is still, licking their wounds and feeling bad about, losing everything a couple of years earlier. But there's one final move that Yeltsin plays, and this is interesting enough, as we're getting toward 1999, as I said, is an incredibly important year, because it is at the end of that year that he makes one final decision. And this is remember back in Y2K? How many of you remember the whole Y2K scare here? We didn't get, planes crashing and clocks resetting to 1900, but we did get Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin announces shortly before midnight on New Year's Eve that he is resigning his post as president of Russia. He feels that he no longer has the backing of the people. He can no longer competently do his job. And in his stead will be appointed his then prime minister, Vladimir Putin, will be caretaker until there are new elections within the following year. And not surprisingly, Putin wins those elections, but this is the first time that we hear of this man, right? Most people have no idea who Putin is, and we begin to see very quickly that he is the exact opposite of Yeltsin in almost every way, shape, or form, right? Where Yeltsin was a drinker, Putin was not. Where Yeltsin was gregarious, Putin was austere. Where Yeltsin was outgoing, Putin seems to be very much introverted. He holds his cards very closely to him. He's a calculator. He is a deep thinker. And, again, I said in the previous lecture, Putin is unbelievably smart, right? He has almost genius level IQ, and this is hard for some people who don't like him to accept. But even if you don't like him, even if you think of him as an autocrat, I mean, he is in many ways a political chess master. And very quickly we see throughout 2000, 2001, 2002, right, that he really is Russia's Grand Admiral Thrawn, if I can make a nerdy pop cultural reference here. And I think the parallels with Star Wars are worth dwelling on for a couple of seconds here, right? And this is original Star Wars canon, not the Disney stuff. So, if you remember in Return of the Jedi, Death Star explodes, Battle of Endor, Galactic Empire loses, the Emperor, Darth Vader, Admiral Piet, all the top leaders of the Empire are killed. The Empire limps on for a number of years, right, losing one battle after another, and it kind of engages in various stages of internal decay, right? Local governors and sector leaders just kind of take control of their various systems and become these little petty dictators, these little despots. The empire is effectively what Russia was in the 1990s, this fragmenting, dysfunctional, corrupt system. And a few years later, into the fray comes out of the unknown regions. In Putin's case, it's really out from the ranks of the KGB. This man who is going to clean Russia up, who is going to make the Galactic Empire great again, who is going to fix the wrongs of every disaster that befell it from that one critical moment. And in that sense, Putin is one who is regarded as the fixer of post-Soviet Russia. And I think that we really cannot and should not underestimate the level of popularity that he has accumulated over the past 20 or so years. And yeah, we saw early on these images of Putin being, the judo master, right? I mean, he is I think a second-degree black belt, or, he knows how to take people down. This, of course, is part of his earlier training, his military and KGB training. Now, sort of like Grand Admiral Thrawn, right, he rises through the ranks of the old system and is ready to effectively inherit that system at the moment the system collapses. So he's a young KGB officer actually stationed in East Germany in 1990. He sees the wall coming down. He witnesses really the end of the Soviet power monopoly. And whatever future that he might have had in that state is no longer there. He's recalled back to his hometown of what was then known as Leningrad, right, today St. Petersburg, effectively waiting new orders. And it is within the 90s that he kind of emerges through the ranks to become the prime minister under Boris Yeltsin. And my guess is this, is Yeltsin's decision to resign at the end of 99, already with Putin as prime minister, was a prearranged agreement between Yeltsin and the state apparatus. Because shortly after Putin becomes president, right, he pardons Yeltsin. And Yeltsin is just simply allowed to retire and live out the rest of his few remaining years in relative obscurity. But what this now means is that there's a new man in town, right? There's a new sheriff to effectively clean Russia up. And the images that come out could not be more different from that of the previous gregarious Yeltsin. So whether he's the judo expert, the motorcycle rider, the Bond villain, whatever it is, the patriot, the one who is going to reinstate a sense of pride and historical memory for the Soviet Union. Even to the point of being sort of this alpha male, right? He kind of reminds me of that guy who used to do the Dos Equis commercials, right? The most interesting man in the world here. The branding image of Putin is a clear sign that there is a new leader in Russia. Russia has taken a momentous turn in 2000, and things are going to be excessively different, right? So it took me a while to Photoshop that one, but I always loved doing that. That leads us to sort of opine here for a moment. Is Vladimir Putin Russia's savior? Right? This is a question that I ask in my comparative politics class, but because we're focusing this week on the underpinning philosophies of Russian foreign policy, we cannot separate that from Putin's leadership and Putin's philosophy. So we got to sort of engage a little bit in history. We got to do a little comparative politics here. Is Putin Russia's savior? The short answer is this. If you are 40 years and older, chances are your answer to this question is going to be yes. If you're younger than 40, particularly 35 and younger, or even better, in your 20s, the answer is most likely no. And why is that? Because one of Putin's primary narratives, and this still works well today, especially among those 45 and older, definitely among the 55 and up crowd, is that he came in to save Russia from the chaos of the 1990s and Yeltsin. This cannot be overlooked, and it cannot be underestimated, right? This is Putin's ace in the hole card. If Russians remembered the 90s as chaos, dysfunctionality, organized criminal activity, unemployment, alcoholism, moral, social decay, and Putin is now here to clean everything else up, people are going to remember that. People are going to juxtapose Russia in the 90s with Russia from the 2000s afterwards. Now, here's the thing. This works only for people about 40 to 45 years and older, and especially among the pensioners. The longer Putin is in power, and the man has been in power in some degree, shape, or form for 20 years. At some point, the older end of that generation is dying out. Younger generations of Russians who they have no working knowledge of the Soviet Union, and they have little to no memory of the 90s, are going to just see Putin as this perennial leader who never goes away. So this power base, this sense of saving Russia, it's a limited thing, but it works. Right? It works as long as the majority of the Russian electorate tend to be on the older age. But this recurring juxtaposition has been part of Putin's leadership for the past 20 or so years. But more than just simply saying, hey guys, remember the 90s? Right, be quiet. It's also a synthesis of both particularly Russian and exclusively Soviet political culture and political symbolism. Putin also taps into this mindset among middle-aged and older Russians that the Soviet Union was a great place to live. And, look, while this is not the definitive answer to this, I spent the previous spring semester of this year living and teaching at an American university in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. It was wonderful, wonderful experience. I cannot wait to go back. But I remember talking with my students, and, here they are, 19, 20, 21 years old, and they all will say that their parents, and especially their grandparents, will, go to their grave thinking that the Soviet Union was the best time to live in Uzbekistan, the best time for them, right? And here we are, we're talking really the late 60s, the 70s. This is probably at this point for those students more so the grandparents. It's the Khrushchev years. It's even the Brezhnev years. It was a period of progress, a period of science and technology advancements, of cultural diversity, of cultural enlightenment. So for the Soviet Union to collapse and Russia in the 90s to kind of forget all of that and, distance itself from, the memories of that period, I think does a major disservice to many Russians. Putin effectively said, no, be proud of the Soviet Union. Be proud of its accomplishments. Sure, the Soviet Union had its vices, but it also had its virtues. Every state does that. You cannot throw out the whole thing just because of Stalin or gulags or labor camps, right? That stuff was in the 30s and the 40s. The Soviet Union in the 60s, the 70s, and even the 80s was a period, it was really the golden age. And we'd have to remember, the Soviet Union was the first to put the first satellite in space. The first man, Yuri Gagarin, in space. The first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, in space. She's still alive. Many people don't even know who she is, right? People tend to forget that. The only thing that the Soviets lost as far as the space race was putting the first man on the moon. So in this sense, Putin's sense of patriotism after a decade of post-Soviet incongruency definitely resonated among Russians, right? The emphasis on the Victory Day parades every May 9th, the emphasis on, I wouldn't say Soviet holidays, but things like International Women's Day and the 1st of May, right? These are things that people remember. They're still celebrated, right? In many of the other post-Soviet states. My time in Uzbekistan was, there are specific Uzbek holidays, but there are still Soviet legacy holidays that are celebrated with the same degree of enthusiasm. What's even more so is that this patriotism does two things. One, it emphasizes the unity of the Russian people, the Russian ethnos, largely centered around language and religion, the Russian Orthodox Church. But the heterogeneity, the diversity of the Russian state, right? Russia is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic state. So as much as Russia, the state of Russia, can look to Christianity as one of its core founding beliefs, it also has a heritage in Islam, in Buddhism, in Judaism, among others. And so Putin is not pushing this, mono-ethnic, xenophobic state, but more to the point, embracing the diversity that is Russia. Chechens are just as much Russians as Tatars, as English, as Georgians, and Armenians, and Siberians, as well as Russians. But more to the point on the international front, people will look at Putin as Russia's savior for reasserting Russia's place in the international arena as both a partner to, and, if necessary, a counterbalance to the United States. So, within the assigned readings for this week, and I have them, listed below, there are two in particular, both published within Foreign Policy magazine. You have Michael Hirsh and Ben Sol's articles, and they both want you to believe that, or they both argue, more appropriately, that Putin is anti-American. He's anti-Western. He hates the West. He hates democracy, right? He hates everything good and wholesome that comes out of the United States, right? Hence the reason why McDonald's, just packed up and left after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's not really true. Before Putin became public enemy number one with the West, he reached out to the United States, right? But with this idea that Russia is no longer going to be a follower or a supplicant, but Russia is going to be an equal partner to the United States. So we can think about, right, the détente that the US and the Soviet Union had in the 60s and the 70s and apply that to now the 2000s. It's not a clash of ideologies. It's not a race over who is going to win over the developing world, but it's a way in which the United States can and should see Russia as a reliable partner in dealing with a number of transnational problems, challenges, and crises. Global terrorism, human rights, migration, climate change, the depletion of natural resources, the collapse of states and civil wars throughout the Middle East, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and elsewhere. This is really an acknowledgement, an early acknowledgement that Putin gave towards global multipolarism, right? In a way, Putin, or at least people very close to him, have read the poli-sci literature. They may have read Mearsheimer. They probably have heard about Christopher Lane. They know about unipolarism, multipolarism. This seems to be absent in the mindset of State Department officials in Washington. But Putin effectively said that throughout the 2000s, right, the United States no longer runs the world. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and that's not Russia throwing a gauntlet down in challenge, but that the United States can continue to foster global stability by working with other regional powers and partners, Russia being one of them. And, look, you can say something, but you also can have meaning to that when you have the numbers to show. And, again, I don't know whether we should attribute this only to, Putin himself, but look, the numbers are clear, right? Russia's GDP change over the last 30 years notes a seismic change between Yeltsin and Putin. So in the Yeltsin period, right, we're talking here about economic, more than a recession. If the economy collapses by, at least in 1990, we're talking about 2%, then 5%, and then by 92, 93, almost 15%. This isn't a recession. This is economic collapse. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the residual effects of economic shock therapy, right? So if you're at the top of this list and you're making money, you don't care. But if you are a factory worker that suddenly found their jobs eliminated, you're down here. So the Yeltsin period was just absolute economic misery. It begins to peak again towards the end of his tenure, but the best periods of growth, almost an absolute reversal, happen under Putin. There's only, a couple of dips here. You here got this one, which is the 2008-2009 economic crisis. Everyone took a hit on that one, right, including Russia. But note, the following year after an economic dip, boom, all of the losses have been regained. We have another one here, 2015. This was after Russia's annexation of Crimea in the Ukraine, and then the following year, economic recovery, and then, of course, 2020, COVID, followed by another year of growth. Now, it remains to be seen where Russia is going to be, GDP-wise, in the wake of the Ukraine war. My guess is that if it once again falls below the zero line, the following year, we'll see another spike. So, I mean, look, the numbers don't lie here. Under Putin, life got better. People made money. Things fixed themselves. Under Yeltsin, everything fell apart. Under Putin, everything seems to be on the upward trend, right? And again, this little dip right here is the 2009 economic crisis, followed again by growth. So, even in the United States, right, we attribute economic problems to whoever's in the White House, or economic growth in the same way. So, people are blaming Biden right now for gas being, $5 a gallon. Is he primarily responsible for that? No. Can he do something about it? More than what he's doing right now? Sure. But at the same time, let's just say that, next presidential term, gas goes, under $2 a gallon again. We will be singing praises to whoever is in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So the popularity that Putin possesses among the people is more than just simply rhetorical and ideological. It's tangible. It's monetary, right? It's financial. And, one final chart here to show the power of the ruble, right? Not exactly a currency that I would really go out and buy money in, but, in the wake of the Ukrainian invasion a couple of months ago, right, the value of the ruble almost, more than doubled, right? So we're talking about, the value actually halved if you think about this, right? So we're talking here about, right now, the conversion rate is, let's say, about 60 rubles to $1 US. So another example of just Russia hitting a spike and then all of a sudden recovering. Right? Let's put this in a little bit more of a thing just within the last year here. The ruble has recovered already from the sanctions and the economic fallout from the invasion. And, at one point, maybe about 2 weeks ago, the ruble was almost approaching 50 per US dollar. So we're talking here basically the strongest the ruble has been in years. Who do we attribute this to? Well, whoever's in power. So under Putin, Russia has shown evidence after evidence that it is a rising power. But remember, it's a power that can challenge the United States in a number of areas, right? Not replace it. And that's why you have to kind of go back to this timeline of Russia's foreign policy development and note a few more things. I would say that if 1999 was one of the critical years, right? It's the apex of American unipolarism, the nadir of Russia's post-Soviet experience. 2 more years are important to note, 2008 and 2014. Now, American unipolarism begins the decline on September the 11th. And while the U.S. remains a major global power throughout the early 2000s, the second war in Iraq certainly kills a good amount of its credibility, while Russia is repairing things within its own country. Now, in 2004, NATO engages its second enlargement, right, which includes the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Also includes Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovenia. This is the largest single expansion that NATO undertakes. And in the same way that NATO's expanded in 99, it's seen as, if not an open threat to Russia, certainly a breach of trust. A lot of these states were undergoing entry into the European Union. So for them individually, getting into NATO was kind of like a mid-level, a mid-journey reward, right? There's this understanding, although it's not required, that if you're applying to get into the EU, if you can get NATO membership first, you're doing something right. Now, for each of these states, I don't think, maybe the Baltics is a different story, but for Slovakia or Romania, I don't think that NATO membership is in any way a challenge to Russia. But for Russia, what this does is it just simply shows that NATO it continues to be there, and it continues to move ever closer to its borders. The inclusion of the Baltic states puts NATO right on Russia's doorstep. To that, we have the first Orange Revolution in Ukraine, right? There's 2 big uprisings. The first one is the Orange Revolution in 2004, which is the first time that we see the dislodging of a pro-Russian, pro-Moscow government in favor of a more open, pro-Western, reformist-minded set of leaders. None of them are paragons of democracy. Let me just be honest with you here. But it's the first time that Ukraine begins its looking to the West rather than relying on Russia. In 2005, Russia retakes Chechnya, right? So the embarrassment, the open wound from the 90s has been fixed. Now, there's 2 ways that this happened, right? The military has certainly been remodernized and re-equipped, but I think a large part of the long-term pacification of the region has to do with Putin reaching out to many of the local leaders, in particular one. His name is Ramzan Kadyrov. He's an interesting, very colorful individual, not someone that you really want to meet on a one-on-one basis. He's very, very dangerous, but he is one whose loyalty has, for lack of better explanation, been bought by Putin, right? Putin, I think, was smart enough to realize that money gets you power within that region. And he asked Kadyrov what his price was. The price was made, and Putin makes it every single year. Kadyrov effectively runs Chechnya as his own personal fiefdom. So we're not exactly talking about Russian constitutional law regaining a foothold in the region, so much as Chechnya remains an autonomous province under the loose federation, right, of Russian law. But the law of the land is Kadyrov's law. And currently, Kadyrov and a number of Chechen mercenaries are fighting alongside Russia in Ukraine. Putin gives a major speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And I've linked the video within this playlist. I didn't do the subtitles, as was already done before me, but this is a very, very important speech that Putin gives because it's the first time that he openly declares the inevitability of global multipolarism, right? and the dangers of unipolarism. So, in '07, I think it's sort of safe for him to kind of, chide the United States and its Western allies for its, crusade in Iraq, as well as supporting other efforts at regime change around the world that, lead to really nothing except chaos, dysfunctionality, and state collapse. And then comes 2008, right? This is an critically important year for a couple of reasons. The first is the United States gives the green light to Kosovo, which has effectively been a UN protectorate for nearly a decade, right? It's been administratively separate from Serbia, to go ahead and unilaterally declare independence. The United States supports its effort at becoming a sovereign state. Now, this takes place outside of any UN agreement, without any agreement or approval from Belgrade. And at this time, right, Russia is not powerless to do anything. But Serbia's refusal to recognize the declaration means that that is a green light for Russia to back Serbia's claims at the UN Security Council. So in other words, Kosovo can declare independence. It can get recognition from a couple dozen states, some powerful ones like the US, France, the UK, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, right? Enough to put them on the map, but not enough to get them in the UN, as efforts for a membership are going to be vetoed at the Security Council by Russia as well as China. So this is the first time that Russia has been able to not, I would say, reverse a US policy, but blunt it, block it, oppose it, right? And to this day, Kosovo remains a partially recognized parastate. It has about 90 or so recognitions, but it needs key recognitions in order to get into major international organizations. Like the UN, it needs China's and Russia's. That's not happening. To get into the EU, it needs the recognition of Spain, Cyprus, Greece, Slovakia, and Romania. Of those five, Spain and Cyprus are the two big ones that are perpetually providing obstacles. And the same really applies for NATO. Now, two other things happen in 2008. There is the Bucharest Conference in April. So we're talking a few months after Kosovo's UDI. Kosovo declares independence in February of 2008. In April, there is a NATO-held conference in Bucharest that, among other things, envisions eventual membership, not only for the remaining countries in the Balkans, which by that point was Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, Macedonia, but also Ukraine and Georgia. Now, these were the two red flags as far as Russia was concerned. It's one thing to consider possible EU membership. NATO at this point, in the wake of the bombardment, in the wake of continued expansion, is now seen as an increasing and unavoidable security threat to Russia. And while this might not have galvanized Russia's actions a few months later in August, it certainly provided some legal or ideological justification for the Russo-Georgian War. So you probably didn't hear about this one because we were all too busy watching the opening ceremonies of the Summer Olympics in Beijing. But, while we were doing the Parade of Nations and the big ceremonies that the Chinese were putting up, a war had broken out in Georgia, right, in the Caucasus. Now, there are two breakaway entities within Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that for years had been outside of the direct control of the central government in Tbilisi. For reasons that I'm not going to get too specific in, right? I just want to speed this along here. The Georgian government, under the leadership of Mikhail Saakashvili, not the most brightest person out there, but certainly pro-Western, anti-Russian, whatever, decides he's going to give the order to the Georgian army to intervene in these two breakaway areas and regain control, right? Because it's one of the only options available to a frozen conflict in a parastate. If the host country is not going to recognize the independence or the eventual independence, the only way to break through the stalemate is to regain control over the region. And how do you do that? Send in the military, right? So the Georgian army goes into both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Both of these regions call on Russia for support. The Russian army, which is just over the border in the Caucasus, right, sends their own forces in to repel Georgian military. Around this time, Saakashvili gives a call to the White House asking for U.S. involvement and support. The United States was just like, are you nuts? We're not going to war with Russia at the time. As a result, the Georgian army is kicked out. This sets the precedent for both of these regions to realize that there is a clear and present threat from Georgia for their own self-determination. They look to Russia for support, and in a complete 180 of Russia's position on Kosovo a few months earlier, both Abkhazia and South Ossetia declare independence, unilaterally declare independence, and are recognized by Russia. Now, this kind of makes a number of people scratch their heads, because if they're using the principles of international law in favor of Serbia against Kosovo, why all of a sudden do this in Georgia? And the short answer is because Russia can, but also because we want to see what reaction we're going to get out of Washington and Brussels and London, but specifically Washington. America's response was overwhelmingly condemning it, with officials like John McCain and John Kerry and others saying something to the effect of, you can't just simply seize another country's territory and call it your own, right? There are rules, there are regulations, there are laws. It plays directly into Putin's hands, because he turns around and says, well, you could do this with Kosovo. And since then, right, the whole Kosovo parallel has been, routinely dismissed as incompatible, as it doesn't count. Kosovo's a special case. All sorts of playground excuses that the U.S. and the State Department and the U.K. are going to give. But, the facts are clear. Russia can effectively intervene into the affairs of another country that was favoring membership in NATO, effectively blocking that, or if nothing else, indefinitely prolonging that eventual thought. Now, NATO continues to expand throughout 2009 to 2020. Albania and Croatia join in 2009. Montenegro, after an internal, some would even call it an internal political coup, in 2017, and then finally North Macedonia in 2020. And this kind of reaches, this for NATO, this kind of reaches the limits, right? The only other countries in Europe at the time that are not in NATO are those that are openly neutral, like Switzerland, Ireland, and Austria. Countries that are hostile to NATO membership, like Serbia. Countries that are internally dysfunctional, where they can't make a united decision about it, like Bosnia. And, up until that time, neutral countries like Finland and Sweden. Now, they have since, applied for and have had their applications accepted. They haven't been formally incorporated into NATO just yet. But, by that point, right, we're really just talking about the final few countries in the Balkans, which by that point it was clear NATO membership was a way of blunting Russian political influence. And this is especially true in Montenegro and Macedonia. So, we already begin to see, the lines in the metaphoric sand being drawn, where the European continent, minus a few little, oases in the Alps and around Serbia, are clearly moving within, right, a Western collective military alliance. We find Russia entrenching itself, reorienting itself in other areas. And this is especially true in the Middle East, particularly its involvement in Syria, in propping up the Assad government, and by that extension, preventing the United States from achieving any kind of regime change or internal manipulation that they like to do. Russia has also been involved in the expansion of non-Western alliances and organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the empowerment and the expansion of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and sort of this loose alliance of emerging economic powers that we call BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and more recently South Africa. Even more recently, and this is within the last couple of months, Argentina and Iran have applied for membership in BRICS, and a few weeks later there are talks of even Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, which means that we're going to have to change the an acronym because it's going to be very difficult to come up with a pronounceable word for all of these countries. But what we see here is Russia is reasserting itself and reorienting itself in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa. It still has a very workable cooperative ally with Serbia in the Balkans. And of course, this is in response to the second popular uprising in Ukraine. Some would call it the Second Orange Revolution. Others refer to it as the Euromaidan movement. But 10 years later, another popular movement dislodged once again a pro-Russian cooperating Moscow government in Kiev with the leadership of Viktor Yanukovych. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the weeks dedicated to Ukraine. But, the ensuing government, first under Petro Poroshenko and now under Volodymyr Zelensky, is openly, declaring their hostility, their distance, their separation from Russia, with this idea that Ukraine has a future in the European community of nations. And if NATO is not going to be an open door for them, certainly the European Union will. This led to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and basically it was a power play. It was an absolute power play. It was Putin effectively taking another country's territory through internal movements and referendas and playing it through some loosely codified international legal framework. But at the end of the day, it was effectively him saying to the West, what are you going to do about it? Come at me, bro. Are you going to go to war over Crimea? And that really was the $64,000 question that continues to this day. Whether it's Crimea or the eastern Ukrainian situation in Donbass, will the U.S., will NATO risk war with Russia over something in Ukraine? And if the answer is no, as most sane people suggest, then Ukraine's sovereignty itself is up for grabs. Ukraine is thrown under the bus for the sake of pre-existing European unity. And it's something that Putin has been known to play by noting the hypocrisy, of the liberal democratic political coalitions. This all really can be described as an emerging Russia in a post-Western world, A post-Western world in which American global hegemony is no longer a thing, I've already said this before, but it's worth repeating again. America is no longer a global hegemon. It is a global power. A hegemon implies a country that has disproportionate degrees of influence, coercive diplomacy, and soft power that no other country can counter. That is no longer the case today. And a lot of this has to do not with Russia or China or Iran providing a better, more enticing brochure, But more to the point that the United States is just expending its resources trying to be that global hegemon. So, the war on terror certainly depleted American resources, and the disastrous outcome of the Second Gulf War, the dislodging, the removal of the Ba'ath Party leadership in Iraq in 2003, the finding of 0 weapons of mass destruction, the opening up of Iraq to all forms of Islamic terror organizations, first Al-Qaeda, then ISIS. I mean, it makes it pretty clear to anybody that when the United States wants to intervene on your behalf in the name of, freedom and liberty and democracy, that you ain't getting any one of those three. You're basically getting years of state collapse, terrorism, fragmentation, weak political coalitions, and your country effectively becoming, a little more than a dependency, on Washington. Even one of its more success stories, Kosovo, remains a dysfunctional parastate. It has no prospects of getting into the EU. It still does not have any visa-free ability to travel, unless you use a Serbian passport or, Serbs in the region are recognized as citizens of Serbia, so they don't really care. And as far as the Albanians of Kosovo are concerned, they can either go to a Serbian passport office and declare themselves citizens of Serbia, because that's what Serbia thinks they are, or they can get a passport. They can get an Albanian passport. They can get a Macedonian one. They're not stupid, right? They'll usually go to the border with about 4 or 5 passports. If they can, they're going to use their Kosovo one. If it doesn't work, be like, well, okay, pick one here. Which one gets me to Germany the fastest? So already we can kind of see a pattern, right? Whether it's, the failed attempts at democratizing Iraq or carrying Kosovo to the UN, the United States has a good job of entrenching itself in a region, but not really providing a better outcome. And I think this was reflected even more clearer in Syria, where the U.S. wanted to involve itself in the civil war, right? Train these so-called Syrian rebels that, allegedly are pro-democratic and pro-Western. It turns out that they're just a ragtag hodgepodge of various extremist movements. And, we see in Ukraine, any crazy extremist movement can, play the America card and, love freedom and democracy. And it's good enough for your, mid-level bureaucrat to trust these guys and get a selfie with. I mean, McCain and Kerry love this stuff. But, the removal of the Assad government in Syria would most likely produce the same degree of chaos that we saw in Iraq. Not to mention, it would effectively mean the liquidation of most of Syria's Christian community, who all backed, the Assad government. It's not that they like the guy, but they know what they can get. They know that they can be safe there. And I've talked to a number of Syrians over the years. I've had some in my classes over the years, right? And they've all said, look, Assad is Assad, but he's the best option that we have. And it leaves you to pause for a moment, right? When you think to yourself, the best option for Syria is the retention of the Assad government. The given alternatives right now are horrible. And it's the same thing with Libya. If we look back at Libya and say, it would have been better if Gaddafi had just remained in power, that kind of tells you how horrible the options available are now. Even in Iraq, right? I mean, no one was weeping when Saddam was hanged. But there is this sense that life under Saddam was safer, more stable, at least more predictable than the, extremist terror-led life that people live, in this day and age. And then, of course, was the disasters. It's a marketing disaster for the United States with the loss of Afghanistan about a year ago, right? When Biden had announced that the United States was pulling out and the Afghan forces were able to stand up on their own and repel the Taliban, I think the Taliban were like, okay, hold my tea. And let's see how fast I can take over the country. And it is amazing how quickly the American-led government collapsed. I mean, the Taliban basically were in full control of Kabul, and we hadn't even evacuated everybody out of the airports. So what does that say about America's image around the world? It's still a major power. It still has significant influence, but it no longer is the hegemon. And I think that it has lost its monopoly on morality, democracy, and any other forms of principles of liberalism. And this is where, Russia, particularly Putin, Lavrov, point to the rise of civilizational discourse. Right? Somebody in the Kremlin read Sam Huntington. After they were finished reading IR Theory, after they were done reading John Mearsheimer, they picked up Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and they decided we're going to make this thing work. And apparently what we find here, right, is this understanding that the world cannot conform to Western liberal democratic standards. It's not that they're incapable of embracing democracy, or that there's no cultural heritage within the group about, let's say, social welfare or social justice. But they are particular to that culture. In other words, it's not that universal democracy is untenable, but that democracy, if it is truly going to be universal, cannot and should not have an American trademark attached to it. Let Russia figure out what democracy is going to be. Let Afghanistan eventually figure out. Let Central Asia, let the Balkans, let the Middle East, let Syria, let them figure out what is democracy. It doesn't necessarily have to come in a prepackaged franchise, form from the United States. And I think that this is really an indirect element, right, of Russian-led soft power. It's not anything proactive. It's just simply a way of getting countries to think, hey, you don't need the United States to modernize. You can look at China, look at India, look at even us, for example, and find your own way. We'll help you do that, but we're not going to impose Russian values in India or Turkey or Syria, for that matter. If we can find a way for you to impose Syrian values within democracy, well, then that's going to be your thing. We're not interested in how long it takes, but know that you don't need to buy into, right, the American timeshare in order to get to that metaphoric promised land. So, I think we're already pushing almost an hour and 20, and I think that it's worth stopping here and picking up in a separate video some more of the specifics of sovereign democracy. But it's worth kind of re-examining everything that we've talked about in a balance sheet, right? So what's important? What did we learn? What are some of the things to take away from this video? The first is noting that American global authority has been diminishing since 2001, as I've already hinted at, right? The 9/11 attacks began the slow demise of American unipolarism, which technically I will say definitively ended about almost 20 years later, right? Almost 20 years later with, it started to decline with something coming out of Afghanistan, and it definitively ended with another thing coming out of Afghanistan, both involving planes. And in that time, we have seen, I would say definitely by 2008, the rise of regional competitors like China, Russia, Iran, even at an institutional level, the European Union, through globalization. Right? The very process of the Jeffrey Sachs notion of globalization has certainly empowered and enriched other countries. And so in that sense, the American-led initiative of globalization is going to inevitably allow other powers to rise. So it's not that America made this major catastrophic historical blunder, but that unipolar powers don't last long. And even in a period of decline, it took 20 years. That's still something for the U.S. to, pat itself on the back with. Some unipolar powers go a lot faster, especially when they writhe and wriggle and kick and scream and shout because no one believes them anymore. So I think that, the costs of global unipolarism and overextension has just, taxed American resources. Even to the point now, what are we doing in Ukraine? We're not turning the tide of the war. We're just simply prolonging it. We're almost just feeding fuel, very small, but we're feeding fuel to a fire that continues to burn another country alive. And, rather than, commit all of this time, effort, and resources to keeping something that's long since passed, isn't it more cost effective to cooperate with the new powers? Now, because the new global powers are non-democracies, from a realist standpoint, that's inconsequential. It doesn't matter. The United States does business with China, and prior to the whole Ukraine brouhaha, we acknowledged the importance of Russia. But if we continue to look at the world through liberalist principles and think that we are the only morally righteous country in the world to intervene and change the world for the better, I think that the U.S. has a major disservice in engaging in new challenges from these emerging powers, and why they are as popular and as alluring as they happen to be. Just think of BRICS for a moment. What do these countries have in common? What does Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have in common? Culturally speaking, not much. Historically, not much either. But all of that is taken off the table. What they have in common is really economics. And in that sense, ideology, like Russian soft power, is non-invasive, right? It's non-proactive. The same thing with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union. If there is any thread that links them all together, and this is at least Russia's position on this, it's the importance of the UN Security Council and the primacy of the UN as a focal point and a voice for international law. Now, we tend to think to ourselves, the UN, powerful? When does that ever happen, right? The UN's only good for, issuing, empty platitudes and taking up parking space, in East Manhattan. But the UN has actually gained significant amounts of leverage and legitimacy over the past 30 years. It doesn't have the authority to do much because it's not designed to do that. But the UN does have significant street credibility. And Russia, China, and others like to use the UN as a counterbalance to the United States sort of acting as its own international organization. And the facts at this point are pretty clear. And it doesn't matter whether it's Biden or Trump or Hillary or Obama or even, Bernie for that matter. America no longer has a monopoly on law and morality. And it doesn't matter who is in the White House. It's not going to change that at all. Right? I think that we've seen this even more clear with Biden, who thinks that we're going to reassert America's multilateral cooperation around the world. We're fixing the errors of the Trump period. But what has he done? Has he repaired relations with Russia? No. He's antagonized it. Has he mollified open-ended issues with China? No. We've almost gotten to the point where we will militarily defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. So it's not that Biden is gaffe-ridden. It's that the world today is now populated with regional powers that have their own agendas, and the U.S. needs to work within that. At least within this context, we can actually engage in some forms of conflict resolution, right? And when this happens, we can see some residual progress, right? We can see some progress in North Korea. Probably the best example of this was up until 2015. Barack Obama was instrumental in pushing for this non-proliferation treaty with Iran, in which the United States, for the first time, began to talk one-on-one with Iranian authorities. Really the first time since the Iranian Revolution in '79. This is one thing I will give Obama. This is one of the fantastic things that he did. And the treaty effectively envisions Iran's reconnection in the global community once it discloses all of its nuclear research. So the treaty says Iran cannot develop nuclear weapons or anything closely related to nuclear weapons. If they want to engage in nuclear energy, it can be clean energy, it can be used for energy purposes. So the US, Russia, the UK, France, China, and Iran, right, all agreed to sit down and work on this. The UN would have routine nuclear inspections within the country. And if everything seemed to have been going according to plan and Iran was cooperating, a number of their bank accounts and other economic assets that had been frozen since '79 would now be open to them again. So Iran stands to come into a major windfall of money that had been blocked from it for, over 30 years. And, the money's been collecting interest. Now, the UN reports up until 2015, 2016 shows that Iran was cooperating, that it was working. But then Obama's term ended, Trump gets elected, and he automatically says this is a disaster. Now, for Trump, it doesn't matter. But what he does do is he plays into the fears and the opposition from the government in Israel, which thinks that, Iran is basically the next, worse than ISIS, worse than Al-Qaeda, it's public enemy number one as far as Israel is concerned. So Trump pulls out of the non-proliferation agreement, begins to, arm Israel even more. And this just antagonizes Iran. And while the treaty is still there, it's limping forward. But at this point, an opportunity, I think, was unfortunately missed. And so, it really was Trump that sort of re-engaged in this notion of American exceptionalism rather than playing the multilateral card. And, in a parallel universe, the non-proliferation treaty would have continued. And at some point, we may have found reformist movements within the Iranian government. But as it stands today, Iran is much more in the sphere of Russia. Okay, I am approaching 90 minutes here, so I think it's more than justified that I, end the video and provide a separate one on the philosophies of Russian sovereign democracy. I hope that this has given you enough food for thought here, and as in the previous video, I welcome your thoughts and comments in the comments section. Please, if this is your first visit to my page, give the video a like. Subscribe if you want information, notifications about further lectures. And hey, if you're feeling generous and you like this stuff, take a quick trip over to my Patreon page. The more sponsors that I get, the more that I can develop these things alongside academia, as well as providing some exclusive stuff for my dedicated followers. But in any event, I hope to have this video up and ready by the 16th, and stay tuned either on Sunday or Monday at the absolute latest for the second half. So thank you all for listening, and I will be back very, very quickly with part 2.